super excited to be here. Thank you for the intro. I just wanted to get from the folks who are tuning in right now what your what position you're in. Are you doing art, dev, design, marketing? Just to get an idea of where you are.
So I work in live ops.
In live ops, okay.
I'm an art director.
Art director. And Nicola, if you don't want to unmute,
I am a multitasker.
A multitasker?
Multitasker, meaning I'm listening to the meeting and doing something else at the same time. But I'm the the director for environmental sustainability for Ubisoft Group, and so I'm representing Ubisoft within the Playing for the Planet Alliance. And I try to multitask, as I was saying, trying to listen to some of the game jam workshops, because I think it's very very interesting. So thank you for doing this one.
No problem. No problem. Thank you for letting me know. So again, I'm Chris Bennett. I have this great title of being the game designer in residence at the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford. But I'll tell you a quick little bit about my background and where it leads into what we're talking about. So I was in the game development world for a long time, back from like the early PlayStation days. Got a chance to work on the Diner Dash brands, EA Sports brands, the Sims brands. And as we find now that games are bigger than both movies and TV combined, they can really be leveraged to help us make better decisions in the real world. Also had a chance to work on some smaller projects, worked on mobile game design to teach Jordanian youth about water and power usage, helping to teach women at American Heart Association to be heart healthy, connecting online and offline events for AARP. And what I was realizing, especially when I started spending time at Stanford about 8 years ago, was there are elements of good game design that are applicable to non-game experiences and also to behavior that happens outside of games. And part of this came actually from my dissatisfaction about gamification, if you've ever heard that term. Back then, I didn't feel like it was super useful, and I was looking for what is the next steps? What would a useful type of gamification actually be like? So something that my research group has been working on the past number of years is game design thinking, which is like, how do we truly engage people and how do we move them to take decisions either in the game or in between the game and the real world, or actually in the real world. And it has three pillars to it. It has game design, but now we're talking about system design, game system design. How do we create compelling game experiences? And behavior design, we actually work with BJ Fogg's Persuasive Technology and Behavior Lab about how and why we make decisions. And the third leg of this particular stool is neuroscience, what's actually happening inside of our brain when we're engaged. And for the Green Jam seems really important to me, because we're not just trying to engage people, but we're trying to move them, and we're trying to move them to action. So in a class that I co-teach at Stanford, which is about creating pieces of online learning, we found out over teaching this class for 4 years, going on the 5th year now, that there's interesting crossover between learning science, like how do people learn, and game design thinking. This is relevant to what we're doing, because we need to scaffold users about things. If we just make a game that's teaching them something that is complex, it's going to be difficult for them to parse it. If we just take a brush and we say, oh, this is a game about climate, but we don't teach them anything, I feel like we're missing opportunities to really teach them some valuable lessons. And so we talked a little bit about and researched about connections between learning science and game design thinking. So in learning science, there's the cognitive part, which is how we study and design of people's internal states. And with game design thinking, that's more about the neuroscientific part, which is what's going on with people, the brain chemicals that are going on with people when they're playing these games or when they're learning. The social cultural part of learning science is around the study and design of the context that are around people. And in game design, that's the system design. That's the context that people have when they're playing a game or when they're learning something. And the behavioral part of it is on both of them, which is the study and design of observed activity. So that's something that we can track with live ops in a game of what's actually happening with people and what sorts of decisions that they're making. When I do user testing or usability testing and get in front of real people, that's a chance for us to really observe their behavior and how we can kind of nudge it into more useful areas. I know this is kind of going deep into the learning science part, but I wanted to give you an idea of where this is coming from. And we really found that if you've ever heard the term serious games before, this is something that's a big connection between game design thinking and learning science. Serious games sometimes gets played off as being kind of academic or something where, well, we're making a game and it's serious, so it may not be fun. But I don't believe that. I've co-taught a class on designing serious games at Stanford. And it's about making something that's fun and that's compelling, but it has an outcome to it. That's the key part, is that it has an outcome to it. And for us, whether we're designing and creating a game that's around green or climate change, there's an outcome to it. So if you come from a game design or development background, you may have heard the MDA framework before, but if you haven't, I'll go through it real quick. It's a pretty seminal framework that came out back in 2004 to talk about a formal and iterative approach to game design. And it basically posited that the mechanics that you have, the rules in your game, are the components of the game. So we're talking about, Mario jumping versus flying. That's a choice of a mechanic. The dynamic describes a runtime behavior. It's what Americans call like when the rubber meets the road. You think that if you've ever heard about the famous like rocket jumping back in Quake, where they created this weapon to blow people away with, and people realized that they could get to hidden parts of the levels by or jump quickly by firing this rocket into the ground and flying up. That's a part where the mechanic, something that was created for the game, meets the dynamic, which is players always find unintended uses for these mechanics that we do, which are often interesting. But also it's when players get together, like we create something that's a compelling single player experience. But then when we get 100 people or 1,000 people or a million people playing this all together, it creates a lot of dynamics. Dynamics are so critical in multiplayer and massively multiplayer experiences. And then it reaches the aesthetics part. And you talk about the emotional responses that are evoked. So if you talk to people who are playing Dark Souls, you typically don't get verbs like, oh, it was easy going, it felt like a casual experience. No, it's a huge, heavy grind, dying over and over and over again. But when you finally get past a boss, there's a huge feeling of euphoria once you get past this. Much different than playing a, we'll say like a match 3 game on your mobile, where there isn't a huge amount of friction that's happening throughout the game. You're just trying to make interesting choices over and over again. And it's something that you can multitask with. It's something that you can relax with. And now these match 3 games are starting to push interesting narratives for people. But the part that really hit me was taking this framework, and I met a designer named Heather Browning, and she extended the MDA framework to add the O, which is the outcomes. Because she was working on mobile games to help make changes in medicine. People were trying to use this to help patients. And so she created this framework to think about this. And it made me realize that we should really be designing backwards from this. I have a lot of students, and I have a lot of practitioners, and a lot of my consulting clients come to me and they say, Chris, I had this great game, or I had this great experience. I just need to add some game design magic. Like it's this magic pixie dust that you put on there. I need to add this. And so they talk about mechanics. What mechanics can I add that will make the game compelling to people? And so what we do instead is we start from the outcomes, right? For me, it's not enough to simply say, I want to make this game and I want to make it green. It's What is it that you're intending on doing? If you're thinking about adding something about planting trees in the real world, if you want to have a story that pulls at the heartstrings to make people think about the effects of climate change, whatever it is that you're doing inside of your game, it's going to connect to outside the game somewhere, either inside of your player or inside the effects that they're having on the world. And so we talk about taking these outcomes and actually writing them down. What is it that you intend on doing? If you want people to plant trees in the real world, what do you want to do? Right? There's a website called, I think it's like Billion Trees or Trillion Trees. And it seems like a crazy idea, but they're putting a stake in the ground and they're saying, we want to actually plant a billion trees because we can see how much effect it would have. And we can actually track how many trees that we've been planting through this. So when you're working on your jam, think about what your actual outcomes are. If you fast forward to the end of the jam and you fast forward to after you've put this out and people have been able to use it for 3 months, for 6 months, for a year, write down what your outcomes are like. If you want to change people's minds, that's fine. How many people's minds do you want to change? How do you want their minds to be changed? How will you know that? And one reason that we typically try to drive people to action is because it's easier to track changes to people's actions and their behavior than it is to their thoughts. So I was working with the American Girl Scouts a couple of years ago, and they were talking about Girl Scouts wanting to save energy, to think, having this program where they could save energy in their houses, but they didn't really have a way to track it. It was just, are you turning off lights in the house? And then you would check it off each day. So what we did was we designed an outcome-based effect around that. So we could think about if we want to save 20% energy usage in the houses of these Girl Scouts, how can we break it down in a way that they could actually affect it? They can't, they may not even see their parents' power bill. There may be things that they can't do. They can't go out and spend several $1,000s on a water heater that's more efficient. So what are things that they can do, and how can they start to push this particular needle? And once we have our outcomes in mind, what is it actually that the metrics that we're trying to hit? Work backwards to the aesthetics. What's actually going to help people to push people? Typically, making people feel guilty, it creates an internal state, but it doesn't always move people to action. What are the aesthetics that you do want to create? They're going to create these outcomes. If you want someone to plant a tree, for example, I use it as an example because it's just easy to talk about. What's going to lead someone to do that? Is this something that they're going to want to share with their friends? Is it something they're going to want to take a screenshot of and send to people? Is it something that they want to feel a sense of pride about? Think about what those things are and actually write down those aesthetics. Think about your users, do some user profiles and talk to users if you can, talk to players if you can, and think about what would push you to do something like this? What would nudge you in the right direction to do something like this, and create a list of aesthetics. Once you have that list of aesthetics, you can work backwards to the dynamics. What needs to happen inside of the game for someone to do this? For example, if you're making a shooter and you want your first person shooter to be about planting trees in the real world, there are places to do that. If you stop someone in the middle of a firefight and you pull up a dialogue box that says, do you want to plant a tree right now? It's kind of a weird time. It's kind of awkward, right? Not the best time because they're in the middle of something right now. You could do something wacky, like say, would you like to plant a tree in the real world and we'll redo your armor so you're at 100%? Again, that's kind of wacky, but it's something that you could do. Think about what are the effects that are going to, whatever you do inside the game is going to create friction. So instead of creating bad friction, see where you can find interesting friction that's going to hit the right people at the right time. And then when you have those dynamics, and with social experiences, it could very much involve other players, right? Other players that are playing at the same time, or it could affect people that are outside the game. I'm working on something right now for a game that I'm working on that's actually, we want players inside the game to help draw in players from outside the game, be able to send gifts to them. So think about what those interactions are like that you're trying to create, And then when you have a solid set of dynamics that are based on aesthetics and outcomes, then we get back to the mechanics. So let's take a quick break. We have a couple people online. I know this is being recorded, but let's think about this. Let's think, I'm always thinking about American audiences, which is crazy. Do you guys have Starbucks there? You're familiar with Starbucks?
Yeah.
Yes.
You go, okay. So think about, I always ask because people would be like, we don't really usually go there. So think about this. Imagine you're analyzing a Starbucks location, and the outcome for Starbucks is that when a customer comes in, we want them to make a conscious decision that allows Starbucks to plant a tree for them. But think about this. What are the desired outcomes like for the customer? What would they want out of their visit, and how would this tree change their experience? And anyone can feel free to chime in. We're just doing a quick experiment right now.
Well, I think they could encourage using your own cup, and for every cup that they don't use, cardboard cup, they plant a tree instead. They're just changing where they're spending their money, basically.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you, if I bring in my own travel mug and they don't have to use one of their cups, they take that, and in fact, it's paid for itself, basically, and that Starbucks is going to plant a tree.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
So
I don't know if they do that, but
what's that?
I don't know if they actually do that. That's just what I was thinking.
Well, it's a cool idea. So we're just making things up because we want to see what this could be like. We're looking at the possibility space. And what does the customer want out of the visit, and how does that tree being planted change their experience? You could have someone who just walks in with their travel mug and says, oh, I don't need a cup, I just bring this with me because, you know, I need more coffee than the normal person does. So how does that change their experience? What if someone walks in and doesn't even expect it, and just says, oh, I just want this, and the person says, oh, because you're not using one of our cups, we're actually going to plant a tree for you in the real world. How does that change the experience of the person who just walked in? Just take a guess. I'd love to hear from anyone.
You'd feel better about getting your morning coffee because something good has happened just by virtue of you doing your everyday, regular behaviors, but somehow you've had a positive impact just by being you. So
just by being you. Okay, I like that. So what is the what are the feelings and emotions that person is feeling?
Acceptance.
Okay, what else? I like that. What are other feelings and emotions people need to happen?
I guess the feeling of being able to do something, because individually you can't. Well, I mean, you can, but it's so negligible. That word. Yeah.
So we're thinking about empowerment, right? Like I actually have the power to make some sort of change.
Yeah.
So, and the funny thing is that we talked about an outcome, but the person who spoke actually brought up a great mechanic. So we're gonna work backwards to that particular thing. So we talked a little bit about what needs to have happen in the cafe. They could have like a little sign with a tree on there that says "Bring in your own cup, and we will plant this tree for you," right? But how does Starbucks set things up so people might choose to bring one with them? Like typically they just walk in, they get their Starbucks, they don't even think about their cup, they drink their latte and they walk on. What's something that Starbucks could set up in their cafe where someone who doesn't have their travel mug with them actually thinks about bringing it next time? Because that's the real action. Is there anything that they could do?
I mean, some people may not even have a travel mug. So the next time somebody comes in saying, hey, have you considered using this travel mug? If you get it today, we'll give it to you half off. And then next time you come in, we'll plant a tree,
Oh, so they would sell you a travel mug. And okay, I love I love the selling the travel mug idea, and that fits in with Starbucks, who clearly loves to sell things. So, okay, so I'll go one even farther and say, hey, if you want to buy a travel mug today, we'll fill it for you for free with whatever you want on the board. You can pick whatever crazy foamy drink that you want, and we'll plant a tree for you. And you'll walk away with this awesome mug.
Yes, that's great.
Do you think that that would have an effect on a certain percentage of people who walk in?
Yeah, I think so.
Think so? Okay. So again, when we think about these things, we always want to start with the outcome. And a good outcome could be, we want people to, well, a bad outcome would be, we want people to help us plant trees. A better outcome would be, we want every third person who walks in to do something that would help us plant a tree. An even better one would be to kind of run the numbers and say, wow, we need 65% of the people who come in at a certain time to do this. Think about what the actual metrics are around that, and think of ways that you can tweak it. The idea of like actually having travel mugs there that you can sell people, that you'll fill up for free, and that will get them into they could even have a tree program that's connected to, I don't know if you have apps there, but we have this crazy Starbucks app that my phone buzzes whenever I walk by a Starbucks because it knows I'm close. I can put in what I want to order and just send it to them when I'm 10 minutes away, and then I can just walk in and get it. And I get stars for my purchases. And once the stars accumulate, I can get free drinks or free food with them. Matching up trees to the stars is something they could do too. But again, it all comes from the outcomes, and the outcomes are driven by the people's feelings. People are not driven by facts, unfortunately. They're driven by their emotions. Is there any questions about the little design exercise? Just wanted to walk you through.
No, it's great. You could even like have a pay it forward type of situation where you say, I'm going to help the next customer that comes in plant trees. And then they would feel good about that when they come in, because they would feel like, oh, the person before me has planted trees on my behalf. Let me do that for the next person and the next person.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm going to go to Starbucks today and I'm going to say, I've got a new program for you. It's called Plant It Forward. And they're going to be like, okay, you need to get out now. No, they're going to be like, that's a great idea. Plant it forward. You can actually plant a tree for someone else, and the next person who comes in, they get to hear all about it. That's super cool. Okay, so now we're going to talk about loops. Game designers love loops. If you ever talk to game system designers, they talk about them all the time. There's very simple ones like Pac-Man. You're eating dots, you're avoiding ghosts, you're completing the maze. There's the other part of that, which is when you eat the big one, you get to eat the ghosts, but it's very simple. And there's more complicated games, console, some of the more mid-core and hardcore mobile games where there's loops that are sitting within loops, and you have meta loops that are going out through the experience. And the reason that we use this is that we are trying to understand what the player is doing over and over again, and how what they're doing over and over again drives other parts of the game. There are short-term loops, there are mid-term loops, there are long-term loops in the game that are loops that are just for engagement. There's loops that are for retention, keeping someone over a long period of time. With a lot of games, there are virality and monetization loops that are going on. So it creates a complex system inside the game. But as I'm thinking about this around education and now around green, not all loops are really created equal. With a functional loop, which is what a lot of games use, I have these examples in here from Angry Birds. If you remember that one, in Angry Birds, you look at what the situation is, you look at what bird you have, you pull back and you aim your bird and you launch it into the pigs to try and release your friends, which I always thought was a hilarious concept for a game. But with a functional loop, the re-engagement in the loop is automatic. But with things that we're doing engagement, especially things that are affecting the real world, people have choices. They can choose whether or not to engage in there. You're not really going to force someone to say, well, you got done with level 14. If you want to play level 15, we need you to pay 99 cents and plant a tree in the real world, right? That's not really the best way to re-engage someone. But with an engagement loop, it views re-engagement as a compartmentalized choice that people are making. So one thing that my colleagues and I put together is something called a core engagement loop. And there are 4 different things that are going on here. There's the assess, where we look at what our choices are and we decide, we make decisions. Our brain is really good about ratcheting down the decision space that we have. So I use a Starbucks example a lot. When you go into a Starbucks in America, just with the drinks alone, there are probably 25 different choices that you have there. But when people go in there, unless they're going in there for the first time, they're not looking at that whole thing. They're quickly getting it down to 3 or 4. Do I want a cold brew? Do I want a cold brew with some weird flavored foam on it? Do I want a hot chocolate, or do I want something sweet, right? Other people might come in there and say, do I want an espresso, a double espresso, or a triple espresso, right? They ratchet themselves down. That's part of the decision, part of the loop. And then they act, they make the decision. But the interesting part here is there's the reward, there's the compelling experience. I'm sure you've heard of like intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, which we'll talk about in a minute. So let's think about this with the Starbucks tree thing. When you use your own travel mug and you get your drink, normally I think they give you like a quarter off or 50 cents off your drink or something like that. How does the reward change if they're planting a tree for you instead? What does the reward actually change for someone? A few of you talked about it earlier, but I want you to think about it from a reward standpoint. And anyone can speak up.
It's a more intrinsic reward, I'd say. It's because you know you've made something good rather than someone else externally giving you something back.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's a bit of both, right? There's definitely some extrinsic reward because if we trust that Starbucks is going to do what they say, and they may not go walk out back and plant a tree right then, but they're probably working with a third party who's doing these. So there is some extrinsic reward that's happening, but there's definitely some intrinsic, and there's a bit of surprise there, right? There's a bit of we're not sure. I wasn't expecting that. This is something additional, right? So let's add a little bit more detail to the core engagement loop. When you decide something, you're experiencing 2 kinds of emotions. You're experiencing the immediate emotion of my decision, but you're also anticipating future emotions. And in between the act and the reward, your anticipation gets paid off or not. And the external rewards kind of get you on that golden path. That's the stars that they give you. So when you can trade these in for another one. The internal rewards are what keep you back, right? The things that keep you coming back at Starbucks are, I understand what kind of drink I'm going to be getting. The barista's there, cool. Every time I go into a Starbucks anywhere around the world, it looks basically the same. And there's a feeling of comfort right there, right? So think about your anticipation of when you make a decision for a drink and what your kind of anticipated future emotions are. But now the person's saying, hey, do you want to use your travel mug, or do you want to purchase one of these travel mugs? How does it change your anticipation about what's going to happen in the future? Anyone can talk about that. What we're talking about right now is the anticipation of what's going to happen. Because normally you just walk in, you get your latte, you give them your card, beep, you get your latte, you say thank you, and you walk off. How does it change your anticipation knowing that they're asking you to make a decision that is going to go towards changing something in the real world? Does it change your anticipation at all?
Thinking.
You're thinking? That's totally cool. And it's hard because this is something new, right? If you would go in and ask someone at a Starbucks, or you ask someone who's in charge of running 3 or 5 or 10 of them, they would have to think about this, right? And so it's okay to take a minute to think about this, because this is something important, right? We create games and you might be jamming on a new game, or you're jamming on a game that exists, and you're trying to create new features in there that are going to drive actions in the real world. It changes the anticipation model. And we need to think about what that means for the person who's going through the experience. Whatever we're doing is going to add friction to the system, but we want to add positive friction and try and avoid negative friction as much as we can. Does that make sense? Right? I'm asking difficult questions here because I'm trying to help you break, maybe not break new ground, but just think a little bit more about the ramifications of what you're doing with this, and actually be able to create some real change. Okay. I've thrown a lot at you with this slide, so I just want to pause to see if there's any questions before I move on. Okay. So the core engagement loop, as I look at it, and that's the assess, the decide, and the act, and the reward, along with the two different kinds of emotions. It's a lens. And once I kind of created this and started looking at it, I realized that I can use it to view all sorts of interactions in the world. I use it to think about politics. I use it to think about fast food drive-throughs. I use it to think about climate change, all sorts of messy things. How do we engage with these messy things in the world? Games, we like to think of games as being clean, but really games are messy. A lot of games are messy on purpose. And when we add something real world to it, it can create kind of a cognitive dissonance where people think, I thought I was playing in a fantasy world. I didn't realize it had any connection to the real world. Or I knew it was going to have a connection to the real world, but I didn't really know how that connection was going to happen. They are travelers. Let's think of these game players as travelers, and we are helping them to understand the world that they travel in. We're not just defining the world. We need to help them understand the world that they're traveling in. And once you observe these messes enough, you can start to deconstruct it and have some understanding of the systems that it lives in. If you haven't had a chance to read Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, a primer, super good book. It's not really long, but it's a seminal book just on systems design and talking about how things affect each other in the real world. And she has some great lists of how you can change things to affect your world. And that's all I have for my pre-prepared talk. And I just want to leave it up for some question and answer and see what you guys have to say.
Thank you so much, Chris. Definitely thinking about what you were saying still. Do you have an answer for us about how your anticipation changes? I know Arnaud put something in the chat as well there.
Yeah, I don't have I don't see the chat right now.
Oh,
so
sorry.
If you could read it, if you could read it to me, I would appreciate. Oh, wait a minute. I think I access. A feeling of responsibility when taking a decision that can have outcomes in the real world can make anticipation hit. Whoa, yeah, that's really cool. Hey, Jennifer called out my planned it forward. Awesome, thank you. Can't unmute my mic. Lots of crying in my house. Yeah. I've lived with roommates before. I get that. So yeah, a feeling of responsibility, right? When we play games, there's not often a feeling of responsibility unless we're playing multiplayer games and we're thinking about other people. But honestly, there's something about games that kind of compartmentalizes that, and we don't often think about other people and their feelings when we're playing these games with them. But you make you make a decision in the game and you realize it actually is going to affect the outside world. It makes the anticipation heavier. It makes the decision more fraught, right? You need to understand it. So if you think about that and you turn it around on game makers, how can we make that easier for them? We either say we want that anticipation to be heavier, we want them to feel the weight of that real world decision, or we say, let's see how we can help them along there. Let's see how we can scaffold them with it. So let's talk a little bit about, the barista at Starbucks is not going to have time to spend 5 minutes, unless it's not very busy, talking to everyone about what this means. but maybe your phone, you could do a QR code and watch a video about this. Maybe they have a they're not going to give out a piece of paper to everyone, but maybe they just have a little bit about what actually happens. Just 4 steps. When you bring your mug in, it we take a picture of it and we send it to these folks, and these folks plant a tree, and here's what happens with the tree, and here's how much carbon over time that we hope that it's going to suck up. And of course, we know that it's not just about that. It's about creating shade. It's about creating better ecosystems. It's about education, right? It's about taking simple things in our world, whether it's turning off lights when you leave the room, financing someone to help them plant a tree somewhere, giving money to a group that's helping water systems somewhere in the world, helping people that are working with endangered orangutans that they're endangered by climate change. Simple changes that players make can affect and have big changes in the world. And that's all about education. So we need to think about when you're playing something in the game, it may be a simple decision that they're making, but later on when they're done with the game, they may want to hear a little bit about that, right? We can't always take the time to educate them inside the game, but when they're done playing the game, you may push them to a YouTube page or a Facebook page about the game, or your own company's internal site, and have some videos that they can watch and give feedback on those things, right? We want to close the loop. We want something to think about making the decision. We want something to make the decision. We want that effect to happen. But if I just say they're going to plant a tree and then I go on with my life and I never think about it again, it only has an immediate effect on my emotions and my world. But if it cycles back and at the end of the year, I get my Starbucks app buzzes and it says, "Thank you for bringing your travel mug in. You actually helped plant 47 trees in the real world last year." Well, 47, that's like something. That's not a forest, but that's like a grove of trees, right? We always want to try and circle back and educate the person on what the effect was and what happened there. So thank you for that note.
That was, I had a quick question or a commentary, what you mentioned about the planting the trees. It kind of reminds me of Ecosia, where, whenever you do a search, you see like how many trees you've saved. And my question is more about teaching behavior, or how do you measure when an activity has become a habit rather than, oh, I remembered I'm getting rewarded for this, so I'm going to do it. Right? Like there's some really reductive research out there that says it takes about 2 months before something becomes a habit. And I'm wondering, just your general thoughts and how we could do that in our games.
So several researchers and psychologists, including BJ Fogg, have put out numbers like that. And I think that all of them have kind of regretted that, because Newsweek will take it and they'll put it out there and be like, it's not a habit until you've done it for 28 days. There is no part of your brain that switches on and makes something a habit, right? There's nothing that happens. It's more about tracking what the intended behaviors are and whether they're reaching those intended behaviors. So if I'm running a dry cleaning business and I want something to make a habit out of dry cleaning, right? I'm not going to suddenly make people dry clean 3 times as much stuff. I want them to do something over time. So we're thinking about if something truly does become a habit, it's something that should become on a regular basis for someone. That's really up for us to define. So if we want someone to bring in their travel mug and get the tree planted for them, we need to think about how often do they come in? How often do they come in where they might have access to even bringing in a travel mug in the first place? Maybe they only keep it at home, or they don't keep it at work, back when people used to work in offices. We need to think about our own internal metrics and then track those internal metrics over time. And the short version of the answer of your question is there is no magic 21 or 28 days. That doesn't really exist.
That's really interesting, because I think
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think it was just more about what would, in terms of our own internal metrics, are there any best practices?
That is still ongoing. I think that's something that people are trying to figure out right now. We've starting to get better at tracking and tracking engagement. One thing that a lot of people are working on right now is how to track motivation over time, because people have different levels of motivation, from I'm completely amotivated, you couldn't pay me $500 to do it, to completely internally motivated, which is I would do it even if no one was watching me, right? Tracking habit behavior is really around neurological level, and that means having to track people over time on a neurological level, and it's still ongoing. I haven't seen any best practices for it yet, but I'm glad that you asked that question, so I can do some more searching.
Thank you.
And Deborah,
Yeah.
I feel like I may have cut you off. I didn't mean to.
No. I was just going to jump in and agree, I guess, and say that something that we're looking at for the jam is starting to track like behaviors and seeing if we can get as many studios as possible to kind of enroll in having their players tracked over, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Is the stuff that they're learning in the game, is it actually having an impact on their behavior? And like, what kinds of questions do you even ask to find out whether a behavior has changed? Because I imagine if you just ask, has your behavior changed on this topic? People will be like, I don't know. But if you ask, are you talking more with your friends about XYZ? They might say, oh yeah, I am. And then that would indicate a behavior change. So I think even coming up with like the questions to ask to track that is difficult.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, because when you're dealing with getting metrics inside of a game, or you're dealing with live ops, we have access to so much data right now for what the decisions that players are making in games, especially in AAA games right now. But once they walk away from the console or the PC or the mobile, it's difficult to make those things, and so we have to kind of find trigger points along the way to watch this. It's the same thing with motivation. Like, people's motivation goes in waves, and we understand that it goes in waves, and we can't really figure out those waves are unless we're kind of pinpointing people along the way, right? And the more pinpoints you have, obviously the better chance you have of seeing those waves go up and down. But if you're just trying to track the effects of what someone's actually doing, you can do things like surveys and pings, and just get cumulative data over time. It's something that a lot of people are experimenting with right now, and there's no perfect things out there. It's just all about being very concise about what data you're actually trying to get from someone. And it's a lot easier to, it's a lot better to ask action oriented questions rather than, did you think about helping trees today? It's, you want something that's actionable. Like, did you hug a tree today? Yes or no, right? And ask someone at 2 o'clock every day, did you hug a tree or not, right? That's something that's action oriented, and something that's easier for us to track over time, to see how many trees they've hugged over time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, definitely.
Right.
And I guess,
go ahead.
no, sorry. I guess, like you said, all of the gray areas in between of behavior and whether things are becoming a habit, etc., that's a much more difficult thing, right? Because you can say, oh no, I didn't hug a tree today, but actually my attitudes towards trees have changed. It's just that I didn't hug a tree today. Yeah.
Right.
It's hard. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's like we all wish that we had that, we all wish that we had that kind of data stream coming in. But once you get into the analog world, the data stream can get reduced by 99%. So instead of wishing we could make that 1% into 50%, we have to think about what's the 1% that would really help us. What's actionable? What's the data that we could get that would actually help us make changes inside of our game?
Yeah,
right. And that's
great.
the part that I look at. I look at a lot of, I spend time looking at a lot of online and offline. So what I was doing for AARP for bringing younger members in was thinking about, were those people things that people do with the ERP online, and there's things that they do offline. But if you think of it as like a double helix, where did they cross over, right? It's those crossover points where someone's doing something online and offline at the same time. If you think about the time when, if you're like at a conference, again, remember when we used to go to conferences and see people in the real world, and I would see Deborah and be like, oh, that's super cool. I'd love to hear more about it. And Deborah says, oh, let me give you my email. And you do all the digits and stuff on there. That's a crossover between the online and the offline worlds. And we want to think about those things very particular, because that's our chance to create change right there.
I have
Any
one
other
more
questions?
question if no one else does.
Yeah.
But I will wait for someone else to go first.
I just kind of wanted to go off of what you were saying, and you had also earlier mentioned, the cognitive dissonance of the real world activities, and I don't know if this is a question so much as just wondering what your thoughts are on that, breaking the immersion or breaking that fourth wall. Is it? I think in our kinds of games, because they're more fantastical, trying to insert on top of it. I don't know how much is too much.
It's something that I'm thinking about right now for something that I'm working on, because if you have a game and it's fun and you're doing these things and you get to plant trees in the game and you see these trees popping up, and they probably give you mechanical benefits in the game, or maybe they just look beautiful. Maybe you're planting them in a garden. You think, oh, that's good. That's part of the immersion. But when you suddenly tell someone, we're going to plant a tree for you in the real world, if you don't make a big deal out of it, it's not going to necessarily affect them much, but it's not going to affect them much in a positive way. Is you're just kind of like, you're like, oh, we planted some trees for you. Oh, that's nice. But if you bring it to their attention, it does cause someone to think about the rollover between the crossover between the real world and the fantasy world that we're creating. And it causes people sometimes to stop and think about it. And we know it's going to cause someone to stop and think about it. So once we know that, we can decide where to put it in the game system. So again, if I'm doing a first-person shooter that plants trees in the real world, not the best idea I've ever had, but you don't do it in the middle of a firefight. You don't want someone to stop and think about a potentially moral action in the middle of that. Maybe you think about it later on in the after action, or maybe you think about it when they're doing their loadout for the battle. Oh, I'm doing my loadout for the battle. This will give me 150% armor if I plant a tree. Oh, that's cool, right? Think about that friction point. Think about the effects that it would have on the player wherever you put it in the game, right? There could be 100 places you can put it in the game, but again, I guarantee you there's really like 3 or 4 or 5 different parts of the game that you could put it in that would make sense, and go through and kind of think about the ramifications of all of those. You take your best guesses and you talk to players about it, but really it's something that you can implement in the game and test on players and see what happens. A gun that shoots seeds. Okay, that's pretty cool. I like that. Yeah, it's really about just being thoughtful about where you do it, because you know that cognitive dissonance is going to happen if you really put it forward to them. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, thank you.
And Deborah, I know that you had a question and you were being polite, and I appreciate that.
Oh, yeah. Maybe slightly random, but I was wondering if you've come across any good examples that have engaged people in political action through gameplay, or through, means that are normally fun, but then translated to real world kind of political action. Because a couple of the things that we're doing through the jam is gathering signatures for petitions to take to COP26. And when you hear like signatures and petitions, like immediately your eyes glaze over. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any, I mean, maybe not so much for Gen Z because they're actually very politically minded, but for other generations as well. Like, have you seen any good examples?
I honestly, I haven't really. There's a lot of, not a lot, there's a number of games that are in kind of the like academic level, or something that you'd show off at a conference, and you're going to have, 1,000 people download this and say, oh, this game is really cool and it's trying to do this thing. But for something that a game that has like a mass audience and trying to do something that gathers signatures, I haven't seen anything like that yet. I think it would be fascinating. It's a great metric to track because either they did the signature or they didn't. Or if you're asking players in the game to help gather signatures, either they gathered them or they didn't. As long as we have a way to track whether that actually happened and circle back and give some sort of feedback to the player, I think that's a fascinating one. And I think you could test it relatively easily without having to make a big production out of it.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's interesting to hear. Yeah, we'll try it out and see what happens and let you know.
Yeah, I'm all about trying it out and see what happens. We have 4 minutes left. I want to make sure they get any other questions that you have. Some great questions about like what's happening in the real world right now. A lot of this stuff is still ongoing. A lot of this stuff is, what we're doing with this jam is very much tip of the sword. And, we're just trying experiments to see what works. And we're relying a bit on the science that's come before us, but there's not a lot of science connecting games to the real world changes yet. And so this is something that we're creating. So I'm hoping that, a year or two from now, I can write, or help someone write a paper about some of the games or some of the jams that you guys are working on right now. I actually think that would be cool.
Yes, I would love that. I'm also going to share with you the survey that we're planning to share with studios and players, because there's a couple of different sort of schools of thought that are working on it. But it'd be great to get your take on, are these questions, like you said, action based, for especially on the player side? Is this something that's easily tracked by players by themselves? So saying like, okay, yes, I hugged a tree, or no, do we need to amend some of that? So I will share that with you if that's okay.
Excellent. I can't wait to see it.
Solid.
Any final thoughts, Deborah? I thought this was awesome. I'm so happy to be able to share anything that I'm working on while you folks are all working on this jam. So it was a great privilege for me.